The Harvard Auditorium erupted in applause as Professor Christopher Brown stepped up to the podium, his eyes brimming with defiance. He was renowned for his sharp-witted orations where faith, particularly Christianity, was often held up for ridicule. But today, facing him was not some naive student, but Michael Jordan, the 62-year-old basketball legend and global icon, seated in the middle of the audience. He smiled quietly, ready for the intellectual battle awaiting him. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories. Amid the crowded auditorium, Michael Jordan, the 62-year-old basketball legend, sat calmly as the guest speaker, there to share insights on leadership and perseverance. Though whispers circulated that his presence was owed solely to his fame from the NBA, at the podium Professor Christopher Brown adjusted his glasses, the corner of his mouth curling with intent. "Let's get straight to the point," he began, his gaze sweeping over Michael. "Research shows that intelligent people are less likely to believe in fanciful notions." He paused for a beat, then smirked sardonically. "But perhaps sometimes family traditions make it hard for people to embrace intellectual growth naturally." He tapped the microphone lightly, the small echo cutting through the murmurs in the Harvard Hall. "Today," he started, his voice low and dramatic, "we're here to celebrate reason, science, and truth, the things that have dragged humanity out of the darkness of superstition." He paused, glancing briefly at Michael, his eyes glinting with provocation. "But, sadly, not everyone keeps up with that progress." He raised his hand, and the large screen behind him lit up with a crisp graph, a downward curve illustrating an inverse relationship between IQ and religious belief. "Look at this," Professor Christopher said, pointing at the chart with triumph. "As intelligence and education rise, belief in supernatural tales like some sky gods sitting on clouds. Astonishing, isn't it?" He scanned the room, his tone condescending. "Or should I simplify it further for those who need it? Say, those who still think God wrote the NBA rulebook?" A smirk flickered across his face. Chuckles rippled through the audience. A few students clapped, while others glanced at Michael, awaiting his reaction. He sat still, arms crossed, his expression unflinching. "I'm genuinely surprised," he said, pacing the stage like an actor in his element. "We have some of America's brightest minds here, the future of science, politics, thought, and yet some still cling to these primitive beliefs." He stopped, turning to face Michael, his gaze piercing. "Mr. Jordan, aren't you the icon of this so-called winning mentality? I suppose your faith is part of that fairy tale to inspire the masses, right?" Laughter echoed through the hall, a journalist in the front row scribbling furiously, sensing a headline in the making. Christopher raised a hand to quiet the crowd, then pressed on, his tone growing sharper. "Let me quote Richard Dawkins," he said, his voice thick with authority. "Religion is a delusion, a virus of the mind. And you, Mr. Jordan, seem the perfect host, a champion, a believer, a figurehead of sports lore in an age of reason." He crossed his arms, his mocking smile widening. "So tell us, what do you have to justify this so-called faith of yours? Or are you just here to parrot empty locker room slogans?" A few students fidgeted, sensing Christopher had gone too far. In the back row, Professor Henry Wallace, a longtime colleague, watched with concern. He knew Christopher loved to provoke, but this personal edge might lead to a misstep. Professor Christopher returned to the podium, casting one more glance at Michael Jordan, his eyes daring him to falter or freeze. But instead of shrinking, Michael stood, the faint scrape of his chair against the wooden floor ringing out in the silent hall, drawing every eye. He stepped onto the stage. "Professor Christopher," Michael began, his voice clear, calm, yet sharp as a blade, "I'd be delighted to address your question and your assumptions." He paused, locking eyes with Christopher, a faint smile crossing his lips. "You pride yourself on scientific thinking, but it's ironic that you start with a bias that belief in God equals a lack of intelligence. That's not objective reasoning, Professor. It's just prejudice dressed up as rationality." The room fell silent. Christopher raised an eyebrow, his smile briefly stiffening, but he quickly crossed his arms, clinging to his confidence. Michael didn't give him a chance to interrupt. "If you truly valued science," he continued, his voice steady but cutting, "you'd know this. Some of history's greatest minds, Isaac Newton, Max Planck, Albert Einstein, acknowledged a higher power in the universe. Newton wrote more about God than physics. Einstein said science without religion is lame. Were they fools, Professor? Or are you just cherry-picking evidence to fit your narrative? A few students nodded in agreement, while others turned to Christopher, waiting for his response. You're dragging out dusty old names to justify yourself, Mr. Jordan. He scoffed, his voice pitching higher than usual. They lived in the Dark Ages before modern science enlightened us. Dark Ages? Michael asked, a hint of amusement in his tone. What about Francis Collins, who led the Human Genome Project, a Christian? Is he outdated too? Or do you simply dismiss anything that doesn't fit your preconceptions? He stepped forward, his gaze sharp, his voice weighted. You call yourself a man of reason, but instead of seeking truth, you start with a conclusion and work backward to justify it. That's not how science works, Professor. Christopher gripped the podium's edge, his fingers tapping out a nervous rhythm. Oh, you think you can outsmart me, Mr. Jordan? He snapped, his tone biting. This isn't a basketball court. A few laughs rose from the crowd. No, he said firmly. This is a place where reason and truth are honored, but you're turning it into a stage for mockery, not debate. He turned to the audience, his eyes sweeping across their faces. I'm not here to preach, but to ask. If faith is truly a sign of weakness, why has Professor Christopher spent his career attacking it? He turned back, a smile flickering. Or perhaps you're the one afraid of something, Professor. Christopher opened his mouth to reply, but no words came. A wave of murmurs swept the room, and for the first time he looked shaken. His eyes wavered, his hands clenched the podium, and he stood frozen in a brief but heavy moment. The Harvard Auditorium fell silent. Professor Christopher stood behind the podium, his fingers still gripping its edge, his gaze flickering between surprise and anger. The forced smile on his lips now looked like a mask about to crack. He cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. Mr. Jordan, he said, his pitch slightly higher, as if grasping for control. Do you think tossing out a few names from history is enough to justify outdated beliefs? We live in an age of science, of evolution, quantum physics, artificial intelligence. Your faith has no place in the modern world. Michael stood firm on the stage, microphone in hand, his eyes never leaving Christopher. He smiled faintly. Professor, he replied, you just mentioned modern science, so let me ask you this. If you truly believe in reason and evidence, why commit a basic statistical error in your argument? He turned to the large screen, pointing at the graph Christopher had displayed. You say high IQ means less belief in God, but Professor, correlation doesn't equal causation. Even a freshman would spot that. In all your years of research, did you overlook this fundamental principle? Christopher flushed, his hands tightening on the podium. Don't try to play clever with me, he snapped, his voice trembling with restraint. This graph isn't opinion. It's based on dozens of real data studies, not your feelings or blind faith. Science has proven that as humans advance, they shed superstitions like Christianity. Michael tilted his head, his gaze cutting like a knife. Real data, you say? He asked, a touch of humor in his tone. Then why not mention studies showing religious belief often correlates with higher mental resilience, stronger communities, and better mental health? Or do you only pick data that supports your story and ignore the rest? He stepped forward, his voice ringing out decisively. That's not science, Professor. That's propaganda. The audience erupted, a group of students in the corner cheering, while journalists in the front row scribbled furiously. Christopher raised a hand for silence, but his face was now flushed, sweat beading on his forehead. You're twisting the issue, he nearly shouted, his voice slipping from control. Things like resilience or community don't prove God exists. They're just byproducts of human psychology, chemical reactions in the brain, nothing more. Love, justice, morality, all just evolutionary mechanisms to serve humanity. You can't use them to justify an imaginary sky god. Michael stood still, letting Christopher's words hang in the air, then spoke, calm but razor-sharp. If justice is just a chemical reaction in the brain, then why do you still believe in it, Professor? His eyes bore into him. If everything's just biology, why do you fight for fairness in academia? Why get angry when challenged if it's all just reflexes? This debate is meaningless, and you know it." He turned to the audience, his voice rising like a wake-up call. "Justice, love, meaning. They're not mere chemical reactions. They're the foundations that shape human society. Faith doesn't oppose reason. It opens doors to truths beyond the limits of pure science." The applause grew louder, a few students standing while Christopher stepped back, his hands trembling as he adjusted his glasses. "You're off topic," he growled, trying to regain the upper hand. "We're talking science, not empty philosophical platitudes. Quantum physics proves the universe runs without any God's hand. Evolution explains life's origins without needing Adam and Eve myths. So what's your counter-argument, Mr. Jordan?" He took a deep breath, his eyes alight with the resolve of someone who'd faced fierce competition on the court. Criticism and pieces all had only strengthened him. Michael looked straight at Christopher, his voice calm but commanding. "Quantum physics, you say?" He raised an eyebrow. "You're right. It shows the universe is stranger than we thought. But perhaps you know physicists like John Polkinghorne, a Christian, used it to explore deeper truths." He paused, then pressed on, his tone sharpening. "And evolution? It explains mechanisms, not origins. So tell me, where did life begin? A random chemical reaction? If you believe that without final proof, aren't you also putting faith in something unproven, Professor?" Christopher started to reply, but Michael didn't let him. He stepped forward, his voice cutting like a blade. "Let me ask you this, Professor," he said, his eyes piercing his opponent. "Where does consciousness come from? Not emotions or reflexes, but the ability to think, reflect, question, like this very debate. Science still can't explain it. So how do you? Or are you just good at mocking without answers?" Christopher's face flushed red, sweat dotting his brow. "Consciousness. It's a product of the brain, of billions of years of evolution," he stammered, his voice strained. "We don't fully understand it yet, but we will. And without God." His tone pitched high, almost self-soothing rather than rebutting. Michael tilted his head, his smile no longer patient but sharp as a dagger. "Not fully understood, you say?" he echoed, a hint of mockery in his tone. "So you admit science has gaps, questions without answers. Yet instead of considering something beyond our grasp, you rush to insist there's nothing. That's not reason, Professor. That's prejudice in a lab coat." The applause thundered through the hall, no longer scattered but unified, powerful. A group of students leapt up, cheering excitedly, while others exchanged knowing glances before turning to Christopher, their former admiration giving way to doubt. He raised a hand, trying to signal silence, but it trembled visibly. You're twisting my argument," he shouted. "Science doesn't need gaps to shove God into. We've moved past that era. You're just a backward athlete, clinging to delusions to prop up your legacy." Michael didn't flinch. He stepped forward, his voice ringing like an undeniable proclamation. "I'm not here to defend a legacy," he said, his eyes ablaze with conviction. "I'm here to defend the truth. You say science has surpassed faith, but you forget faith inspired history's greatest minds. You mock me as an athlete, but you're the one clinging to the delusion that you have all the answers, even when you can't address humanity's biggest questions." Christopher gripped the podium, his trembling hands impossible to hide. His face, once red with anger, now paled. Michael's final words, "You don't have an answer to the biggest questions," hung in the air like a sharp blade, slicing through the veneer of authority he'd once worn. The room stilled, all eyes shifting between the two figures on stage. A professor, once a symbol of intellectual arrogance, and a basketball legend standing unshakable, his eyes burning with faith and unyielding reason. Christopher cleared his throat, trying to reclaim his poise. You're trying to distract," he stuttered, raising a hand as if to ward off the pressure. "Science has given us answers. Not all, but enough to know no God is needed to explain the universe." He pointed at Michael, but the gesture was feeble, lacking force. He took a deep breath, then stepped forward slowly, each movement underscoring the weight of his words. When he spoke, his voice was clear, calm, but honed like a finely sharpened blade. "Enough to know, Professor?" he repeated, a flicker of irony in his tone. "Then give me, and this audience, a proper answer. Where does consciousness come from? Not chemical reactions, not just brain impulses, but the ability to perceive, think, question? Like this debate, can your science explain it fully? Let me ask you one more question, Michael continued. Where did life begin? Not evolution, that's just a process, not an origin. Did it come from a random chemical reaction in some primordial ocean? Do you have solid evidence for that hypothesis, or do you simply accept it because you don't want to consider another possibility? He paused, letting the question hang in the air. And if there's no evidence, isn't your belief in spontaneous life just another form of faith? Christopher opened his mouth to respond, but this time, no words came. He looked down at the podium, his trembling hands gripping the wooden edge, then slowly raised his head, his eyes wavering between confusion and disarray. That's a question yet to be answered, he stammered, his voice stripped of its former certainty. But sooner or later science will find out. We don't need to rely on fairy tales. Michael smiled, no longer gently. Yet to be answered, he echoed, his tone firm. Then let me ask you one final question, Professor. This universe, with all its physical constants perfectly tuned for life to exist, where did it come from? If just one number were slightly off, we wouldn't be here. How do you explain that fine-tuning? Random chance? The odds of that happening by accident are lower than finding a single grain of sand on all of Earth. So do you choose to believe in randomness, or do you have another explanation? The auditorium fell deathly silent. Christopher stood motionless, his hands dropping from the podium, his gaze blank, as if confronting a truth he dared not accept. He tried to speak, but no sound emerged. Sweat rolled down his face, and for the first time in his career, here he looked, not like a learned scholar, but a man cornered. Michael took another step forward, his voice ringing out, sharp as a verdict. "You can't answer, Professor," he said, his eyes locked on him. "And do you know why? Because you don't just mock faith, you fear it. You fear that the gaps in science aren't just unanswered questions, but signs of something beyond human understanding. You fear that a lifetime spent denying might rest on a flawed belief." His gaze softened but retained its resolve. "I don't deny science," he declared. "On the contrary, I cherish it, because science lets us explore the beauty and wonder of the universe. But when you claim there's nothing beyond the material, that's not a conclusion based on evidence. It's an assumption rooted in bias. You can't prove God doesn't exist, because science can't definitively prove a negative. So where does your certainty come from, Professor? Reason, or the very arrogance you accuse the faithful of having? And here's the last thing I'll say," Michael went on, his voice resounding. "Faith doesn't oppose intellect. It's its companion. When science reaches its limits, faith keeps asking questions. When data runs dry, faith seeks meaning. You mock it, but you can't answer the questions it raises. So, who's really afraid here, Professor?" Christopher stood frozen, his hands limp, his eyes glazed. The auditorium erupted in applause and cheers, not just in support, but as if they'd witnessed an irreversible moment. Dozens of students leapt to their feet, their gazes fixed on Michael Jordan with unmasked admiration. Christopher stepped back, no longer the proud man who'd strode onto the stage, but a figure reeling amid unanswerable questions. Christopher cleared his throat, grasping at the last threads of control, but his voice emerged weak and halting. We should move on," he muttered, his trembling hand rising as if to silence the crowd. "Today's topic isn't—" His voice trailed off into the void, unheard by all. No one cared. Every eye was on Michael, still standing firm on the stage, microphone in hand, calm yet resolute. He didn't nod triumphantly or smirk mockingly. He simply stood, letting the truth speak for itself. In the back row, Professor Henry Wallace, Christopher's longtime colleague, rose slowly, his face a mix of concern and resignation. He hurried down the aisle, his voice cutting through the audience's buzz. "Perhaps we should return to the main agenda," he said, trying to steer the debate back to its original course. "There's still much to discuss today." He glanced at Christopher, his look both comforting and urging, but Christopher didn't respond. He just stood there, hands shaking as he adjusted his glasses, his eyes vacant, as if the events had drained every belief he'd clung to. The audience no longer noticed Christopher. The applause faded, giving way to animated chatter. "He just took down Christopher," a student whispered to a friend, eyes alight with excitement. "No one's ever done that." In a corner, a group swapped fervent remarks, voices thick with awe. He couldn't answer, not a single thing. Up front, a journalist scribbled furiously, pen racing across the page, eyes gleaming at the prospect of a blockbuster headline. Amid the crowd, a student raised a camera, lens trained on Michael, capturing a moment everyone knew would echo for years. Michael stepped off the stage. As he returned to his seat, a few nearby students leaned toward him, whispering praise. "You were amazing," one said, voice trembling with thrill. Michael smiled faintly, nodding thanks, but said nothing more. He didn't need to. The room had spoken for him. Christopher, now a shadow of himself, watched Michael with a dazed stare. He turned to the big screen, where his once proud graph still glowed, now a mockery. He cleared his throat again, attempting to resume his lecture. As I was saying," he began, voice quavering, "science shows—" But no one listened. The audience's murmurs drowned him out, and for the first time in his career, Christopher felt utter helplessness. He knew he'd lost, not just to Michael, but to the room that once revered him. Professor Christopher lingered behind the podium, but no one paid him heed. He quietly gathered his papers, hands shaking, eyes avoiding the audience now abuzz about Michael Jordan. His lecture stumbled on awkwardly, his voice faltering and disjointed, but no students took notes. Instead, they whispered among themselves, eyes bright with excitement. "He just did what no one dared," one said, voice full of wonder. "Christopher was always unbeatable, until today." Michael, back in his seat, was no longer an anonymous guest speaker under suspicion. When the conference paused, a cluster of students swarmed him, voices eager and curious. "Where'd you learn to debate like that?" one asked, thrilled. "How'd you stay so calm when he attacked you?" another chimed in. Michael just smiled lightly, replying simply, "I just said what I believe is true." But his humility didn't dim his magnetism. A student raised a phone, recording a brief interview, while a nearby journalist tapped out a frantic message to their editor. "Basketball legend takes down Harvard prof. Huge headline incoming." Words spread fast. Within minutes, audience-recorded clips flooded social media. An ex-post read, "Michael Jordan just silenced Professor Christopher. Watch now," with a video of him questioning consciousness and life's origins. Views skyrocketed, comments exploding. "He's unreal. Christopher got crushed." Debate of the year. In the dim corner of the now quiet hall, Christopher sat alone, hands cradling his head. The conference ended, but the debate's echo lingered in his mind. On the table, his once prized notes and documents lay scattered, meaningless relics of a battle lost. The screen before him was dark, but Michael's questions still rang in his head. Where does consciousness come from? How did life begin? He thought he had all the answers, but now, for the first time in years, he felt small before the unknown. Outside, Michael left the hall, a few students trailing him, thanking him for speaking up. He nodded, his gaze gentle yet firm. He didn't know this story wouldn't end here. It would spread, inspire, and challenge old biases. As Michael Jordan stepped out of the Harvard Hall, the afternoon sun softly bathed his face, reflecting the calm he'd maintained throughout the debate. The crowd of students had dispersed, but the clash's resonance lingered in the air. He walked slowly through the ancient stone corridor, then paused upon seeing a familiar figure. Professor Christopher stood alone, clutching a messy stack of papers, no longer the proud man who'd descended the podium. He looked like someone grappling with his own doubts. Hearing his footsteps, he looked up. His eyes met Michael's, not with defiance, but with a deep pensiveness. After a moment's silence, he spoke softly, his voice tinged with fatigue, yet a hint of honesty. "You know, Mr. Jordan, in my entire career, no one's made me rethink like you did today." Michael regarded him, his gaze steady yet kind. He didn't smile or gloat, simply replying, his voice calm but profound. "Sometimes, Professor, those who try hardest to destroy faith end up strengthening it most." He nodded lightly, a farewell gesture, then turned away. His steps were steady, blending into the fading afternoon light. Christopher watched him go, his hand tightening slightly on his papers, his mind heavy with unfamiliar thoughts. The story didn't end there. The debate video swept across social media from X to YouTube, racking up millions of views in hours. Comments flooded in. Michael Jordan is a legend. Christopher met his match. But beyond a personal victory, it became a symbol of something greater. Faith and intellect aren't enemies, but allies in the quest for truth. Michael didn't just defeat Christopher, he challenged prejudice, sparking a dialogue thousands joined. Christopher sat quietly in the dark corner of the empty hall, alone with the scattered notes before him. The room, once alive with cheering and debate, now held only silence. A silence more daunting than any applause or murmur. A deep sigh escaped his chest, as if the ordeal had sapped his every ounce of energy. His trembling hand reached out, touching the papers, now rendered meaningless. The graphs, equations, scientific citations, all he'd once seen as unshakable bedrock, no longer offered the certainty they once did. He recalled Michael's every question, his razor-sharp rebuttal, and that steady, unyielding gaze. He'd expected a dreamer, a blind zealot incapable of reason, but instead faced an opponent not just smart, but poised and piercing. Consciousness, life, the universe's fine-tuning, he muttered, as if grasping for anything to restore his faith in himself. But for the first time, the arguments he'd trusted implicitly failed to convince even him. The answers he'd confidently repeated throughout his career now sounded hollow. He didn't reject science. He'd devoted his life to it. But perhaps he'd made a mistake, assuming science was the whole truth. He leaned back, eyes closing, recalling his youthful days. He'd once been a passionate student, eager to explore the world, thrilled by every unanswered question. But then he'd been swept into the academic race, where reputation, prestige, and recognition outranked truth. He'd learned to scoff at what couldn't be proven experimentally, to view faith as weakness, a crutch for those too timid to face the universe's randomness. Maybe, he whispered, as if afraid his own thoughts might betray him, maybe the closed-minded ones aren't the believers, but those who mock them. The idea made him shudder. It contradicted everything he'd held dear. Yet he couldn't deny he'd refused to question, dismissed anything clashing with his worldview. Michael hadn't proven God's existence. He didn't need to. He'd only asked questions he couldn't answer, questions he'd never truly dared face. Could I be wrong? He laughed bitterly. It was a simple question, but for someone like him to admit that possibility was no small feat. His career rested on materialism, pure reason. If he was wrong, what of all he'd taught, written, fought for? But if he stubbornly clung to his old stance, was he truly honest with himself? He looked at his hands, once steady as he lectured hundreds, signed research papers, debated dissenters. Now they trembled, not from defeat, but from a different fear, facing his own arrogance. He remembered past debates where he'd crushed opponents with cold logic, but this time he felt no victory. He felt empty, because truth wasn't just what experiments could measure or equations prove. Perhaps it lay in what science couldn't yet touch. He realized changing his view didn't mean betraying science. It meant being truer to himself. He didn't need to instantly believe in God, but he could admit he didn't know everything, and more importantly, he could start listening instead of mocking. He took a deep breath and stood, stepping from the dark corner. He saw light streaming through the hall's glass doors. For the first time in years, he didn't feel compelled to cling to a rigid stance. He felt relief, because now he was ready to ask questions, and perhaps that was the real beginning of knowledge. This story is a powerful reminder that intellect needn't exclude faith, nor faith deny reason. Michael Jordan, with his calm and cutting arguments, proved that standing firm for truth, whether in a challenging auditorium or before the world, can change everything. This wasn't just a debate. It was proof that when arrogance meets truth, truth always prevails. If you found this story meaningful, don't keep it to yourself. Share this video with friends, start a conversation, and spread the message. Hit like, subscribe for more deep content like this. Truth deserves to be heard, and you can help it ring out. The tale of Michael Jordan facing Professor Christopher at the Harvard conference deeply reflects the polarization in today's U.S. society, where debates over faith, science, and culture flare constantly, from social media to public forums. Christopher, with his arrogance in scientific charts, represents a common trend, using reason to dismiss faith as outdated, like how he mocked Michael as a sports icon. Conversely, Michael, with his sharp points on consciousness, life, and cosmic fine-tuning, embodies the spirit of many Americans holding fast to belief amid criticism, not just defending personal faith, but challenging bias with logic. The video's spread on X in the story recalls how hot-button U.S. issues like education or free speech often explode online, shifting public opinion in moments. The lesson here is this: in a nation valuing freedom and diversity like the U.S., don't let Christopher's arrogance or public pressure dim the ability to listen and debate fairly. Michael didn't just win with sharp reasoning, but with poise, like when he stepped on stage, unshaken by personal attacks. Americans can apply this by facing disagreements, whether politics at the dinner table or religion on Twitter, with respect and logic, not mockery or avoidance. Christopher's shift, questioning himself post-defeat, reminds us openness can turn conflict into growth, fostering a more united society amid differences. If you believe faith and intellect can shine together, subscribe today. Thanks for watching, and see you in more epic battles of ideas.